My sister stole my millionaire fiancé 6 years ago, showed up to our mother's funeral, flashing his ring, called me pathetic and alone. Then I introduced her to my husband. My sister Claire walked into my mother's funeral like she owned the room. She had always known how to do that, known how to calibrate her entrance. Not too early, not too late, just at the precise moment when the room was full enough for maximum impact and still unsettled enough that every head would turn. I used to admire it when we were children. I used to think it was confidence. I understand now that it was theater. Claire had been performing since before either of us could name what performance was. She came through the double doors of the Whitmore Funeral Home on Tremont Street with the kind of measured unhurry that only truly selfish people possess. A black crepe dress cut exactly to her collarbone, hair done, not overdone. She knew better than that. Pearls at her ears. And then the ring that had once been mine, or something very much like it, except bigger now, different setting. A 5-carat cushion cut that caught the light from the chandelier in the foyer and scattered it across the carpet like broken glass. And Daniel, right beside her, his hand on her waist, his dark suit pressed, his jaw squared in the way I remembered from 2,000 nights of my previous life, that same practiced authority, that same performance of a man who believed that merely standing somewhere made him the most important person in it. I was standing near the memory board. My mother's face was everywhere. The 1983 photo from her college graduation, the picture from my parents' honeymoon in Lisbon, the shot of her holding Claire and me on either side at the Grand Canyon, all three of us squinting into the same desert sun. I had spent 7 hours with my father's housekeeper assembling that board the night before. I had not slept. My eyes felt like sandpaper. My chest felt like concrete. And I was wearing the blue dress my mother had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, the one she said brought out my eyes, because wearing it felt like keeping some small piece of her alive in the room. None of that registered on Claire's face when she saw me. What registered was the calculation. She looked at me the way she always had, quick, thorough, cataloging, assessing the competition, finding the gap, and then the smile came. The one we used to call the Hale smile when we were girls, except it was only ever really Claire's smile, the one that always meant I won. She crossed the room toward me. I watched Daniel follow at a slight distance, scanning the room for someone more useful to attach himself to and finding no immediate candidates. He looked older, harder around the eyes. There was a tightness to his posture that I didn't remember, something that read less like authority now and more like strain, the way a man stands when he has been bracing against something for a long time and has forgotten that there was ever a before. But I couldn't think about him yet. Claire had already gotten close enough to touch my arm. Elaine. She used my full name. She always did when she was performing. I am so sorry about Mom. She pulled me in for a hug that lasted exactly the socially correct number of seconds. Firm, practiced, smelling of something expensive. And then she leaned back, held my arms, and looked at my face the way someone looks at a child who has skinned their knee. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I said. You look exhausted. Our mother died, Claire. She nodded gravely, released my arms, looked around the room with the expression of someone quietly taking inventory. She said, "Can we talk for a minute? Somewhere quieter?" I should have said no. I should have told her we could talk after the service, or at the reception, or literally any time that was not 45 minutes before I had to stand at a podium and read the eulogy I'd written at 2 a.m. with shaking hands. But my mother's voice was in my head. My mother, who had spent the last 6 years quietly, persistently hoping that her daughters would find their way back to each other. My mother, who had died 3 weeks ago in a bed at Brigham and Women's Hospital with both of our names on her lips, even though one of us hadn't visited in 4 months. I followed Claire into the side room. It was a small space the funeral home called the family room, a love seat, 2 chairs, a box of tissues on the side table, a water carafe, a painting of birch trees in winter that someone had clearly chosen for its neutrality. The lighting was the particular soft yellow that felt designed to make grief more manageable, the way certain doctors' offices are painted the particular shade of blue that is meant to lower your blood pressure before you get bad news. Claire sat. I stood. She told me about the summer house first, Cape Cod. They'd bought it in March. 8 bedrooms, private beach, a dock with 2 kayaks, and a motorboat already moored. She described the light in the mornings, the way the fog came in off the water around 7 o'clock and burned away by 9. She said they were planning to put in a tennis court by fall, and that the listing price for the property next door had just gone up by $600,000, which was an indication, she said, of where the market was moving. Then she mentioned the nursery. They were converting the 3rd floor. Sea glass colors. She had seen a photo in Architectural Digest and had clipped it. She had already hired a designer from Newport who specialized in high-end nurseries. She wasn't pregnant yet, she said, but they were trying, and the room would be ready when the time came. She mentioned a name for a girl that she and Daniel had been discussing. I will not repeat it because it is not mine to give, and also because it turned out to be the name of a room that would never be used. Then she talked about Daniel's company, the acquisitions he'd made in the past 18 months, the 2 startups he'd absorbed, the board seat he'd secured on some clean energy venture in Austin. Her voice had a kind of rolling ease to it, the way water moves when there are no rocks to catch it. Smooth, confident, relentless. Every word landed with deliberate weight. I understood what she was doing, and I let her do it, because some performances need to be seen through to the end before you can address them. And then she stopped talking about the Cape Cod house. She looked at me directly, in that way she had, head slightly tilted, eyes clear and steady, and she said it. Poor you. Still alone at 38. I got the man, the money, and the mansion. There was a beat of silence in that birch tree room. I held her gaze. 6 years ago, that sentence would have cracked something open in me. 6 years ago, I was a different person entirely. Someone who measured her own worth against her sister's scorecard without fully realizing she was doing it. 6 years ago, those words would have traveled straight to the wound and settled there. And I would have gone home and I would have cried. And I would have told myself that she was right because some part of me had always believed she was. But I had done 6 years of work since then. Real work. Painful, unglamorous, methodical work. Therapy twice a week for the first 2 years with a woman who didn't let me get away with anything. The long, often boring process of untangling who I actually was from who Daniel had wanted me to be, from who Claire had spent 38 years trying to make me feel like I wasn't. I had built something on the other side of all that loss, something quiet and solid and entirely mine. I smiled at her. I said, "Have you met my husband yet?" And I watched her face change. I need to go back. I need to go back to the beginning of this story because the ending only makes sense if you understand what came before it. Not just the betrayal, which is the part everyone fixates on, but the years before the betrayal. The pattern that made the betrayal possible. The way families teach you who you are before you're old enough to question the lesson, and the way some people learn those lessons and turn them into weapons. Our parents are Patricia and Robert Hale. Were, in my mother's case. Patricia Hale passed away on May 3rd, a Tuesday, at 11:40 in the morning, from complications following a second stroke. She was 67 years old. She was a high school English teacher for 31 years. She kept a garden. She made a chicken pot pie that I have never tasted anything close to since. She played Scrabble badly and enthusiastically. She read 2 books a week without exception, even in the last year when her vision had gotten difficult. She was, in every way that matters, a genuinely good person. And I say that not to sentimentalize her death, but because it is simply true, and it matters to this story, because good people do not always protect their children from each other in the ways they should. Even good people sometimes mistake keeping the peace for building it. Claire is 3 years older than me. She is 41 now. Growing up, that gap felt enormous. She was beautiful first, confident first, interesting first. She figured out how rooms worked before I'd even learned to enter them. Our mother loved us both. I believe that without reservation. But she and Claire shared a frequency I never quite accessed. They had the same laugh, the same way of gesturing with their hands when making a point, the same taste in certain things, movies, colors, the kind of entertaining that made a room feel like a party. I was closer to my father, quieter, more interior. Books and long walks and the kind of conversation that starts at one thing and ends somewhere entirely different 3 hours later. I don't think our mother played favorites. I think she just didn't always notice when Claire used me as a step. When Claire got into Boston University on a partial scholarship, the house threw a dinner party. 12 people, my mother's good dishes, a cake. When I got into BU 2 years later on a full academic scholarship, one that covered room and board, which was not insignificant in our house, where money was a genuine concern, my mother made my favorite dinner and gave me a card that said she was proud of me. It was a perfectly kind response. It was also, objectively, a smaller response. I noticed. I always noticed. I filed it away with the other things I wasn't supposed to say out loud because saying them would have made me the difficult one. I'm telling you this so you understand. Claire and I did not have a simple rivalry. We had a decades-long negotiation conducted in small currencies. Attention, praise, the particular warmth of being fully seen that I had mostly made peace with by the time I was in my late 20s. You learn to stop wanting what you were never fully given. Or you learn to find it elsewhere. The finding elsewhere is the part they don't tell you about. It is the most important part. I found it in work first. In my mid-20s, I built a real career. I was a brand consultant based in Boston. Corporate identity, communication strategy, the kind of behind-the-scenes work that companies pay serious money for when they're trying to change how the world perceives them. I was good at it. I understood how to find the true thing inside a company, the actual story, not the polished version. And I understood how to tell it. By 29, I had my own client list. By 30, I was making good money. Not Daniel money, but mine. And that distinction turned out to matter more than I knew. I met Daniel Reynolds at a charity gala in January of 2015. He was 36, I was 32. He was exactly the kind of man you imagine when you imagine a man like that. Tall, magnetic, with a particular gift for making the person he was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. He had studied economics at Georgetown and done his MBA at Wharton, and he mentioned neither of these things until the second date, which I took as a sign of confidence, and now understand was simply a different kind of calculation. He was in angel investing. He'd backed 3 startups that had done well, nothing legendary, but enough. He had a brownstone in the South End and a sailboat he kept at Constitution Marina, and he drove a black BMW that was always exactly clean. We dated for 8 months before he told me he was in love with me. He said it on a Sunday in September, in the kitchen of his brownstone, while we were making eggs. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the pan. And something about that, the offhandedness of it, the fact that he said it like a thing he'd only just discovered, made me believe it completely. 18 months in, he proposed. Yacht in the harbor, sunset, a speech he had clearly rehearsed but managed to deliver as if he hadn't, which was its own kind of skill. The ring was 5 carats, cushion cut, platinum band, and it was exactly the kind of ring that makes other women's eyes go wide. I said yes before before he'd even finished asking. I was 32 years old and I thought I had found the shape of my life. Claire was my maid of honor. That was never in question. Despite everything, despite all the small, accumulated negotiations of our childhood and our adult years, the dinners where she had talked over me, the family visits where she had quietly moved to the center of whatever room we were in, she was my sister. She came to the engagement party my parents threw at their house in Newton in November of 2014. She stood next to me in the photos. She gave a toast that made everyone cry, that made even me cry, about growing up together, and how she had always known I would find someone worthy of me. She used the word luminous to describe me, and I believed her. The next morning, she texted Daniel to congratulate him. I know this because I read the thread 18 months later, after everything fell apart, when I went back through his phone looking for the beginning of the ending. The text she sent him at 8:47 in the morning was warm and bright and just lightly flirtatious, the way Claire's messages always were. A tone calibrated so precisely to the edge of acceptable that you could read it as sisterly warmth if you weren't watching for anything else. He responded within 4 minutes. They texted for 6 hours by the time I woke up that morning and came downstairs in his brownstone to find him sitting at the kitchen table with his phone face down and his coffee going cold. I am telling you the timeline because it matters. My sister began pursuing my fiancé at my engagement party while I was in that same house, while my mother was pouring champagne from the good bottle my father had been saving, while my father was shaking Daniel's hand and saying, "Welcome to the family. Welcome. We're glad to have you." She had already decided. The months that followed the engagement were the strangest of my adult life, and not in any way I could name while I was living them. I could only name it later, in retrospect, with the hard-won vocabulary that therapy eventually gives you. I was experiencing a sustained low-level alarm, the kind your nervous system generates when it has registered a threat that your conscious mind has not yet caught up to. Daniel was distracted. I told myself it was work pressure. A deal he'd been working on since October was taking longer than expected, and he was in conversations with 3 different potential co-investors who all wanted different things. I told myself that. I leaned into the explanation because it was available and I didn't want to look at the other ones. He was distant in bed. He canceled 2 consecutive dinners without rescheduling. He started keeping his phone face down in our presence, which was new. I noticed these things the way you notice a sound in a house you've lived in long enough. You know something is different, but you can't place exactly when it changed. I started losing weight, not intentionally. I simply couldn't eat properly. 7 pounds over 3 months, which my doctor noted with a slight frown at my March appointment. She asked if anything was stressful at home. I said not specifically. She said keep an eye on it. I said I would. The headaches came in the afternoons, reliably, starting around 2 o'clock and settling behind my right eye until 7 or 8 in the evening. I was not sleeping. I would lie awake in Daniel's brownstone at 4 in the morning and try to name what was wrong with me, and the closest word I could find was unmoored. Like I was watching my own life from slightly to the left of where I was supposed to be standing. I booked 2 wedding vendors in that period. The florist, a woman on Commonwealth Avenue who specialized in wildflower arrangements and had a 3-month wait list, and the caterer. I went to both appointments alone because Daniel said he trusted my taste. I sat in those offices and talked about centerpieces and past appetizers, and I felt, both times, a wave of something I could not explain that passed through me like cold water and was gone before I could examine it. I thought I was just nervous about the wedding. I understand now that what I was feeling was proximity to the truth. The body knows. It registers what the mind isn't ready to name. My body had been registering something for months. In February of 2016, 4 months before the June wedding date, 10 days before I had to give the florist a final answer on the centerpiece concept, I went to Daniel's office to bring him lunch. He hadn't been eating much at home, and I was worried. I had made sandwiches, the good kind, from the bakery near my office, the ones with the roasted vegetables and the aged cheddar that he'd once said were the best sandwiches he'd ever had. I understand how that sounds now. I was worried about the man who was dismantling my life. I was bringing him sandwiches, but I didn't know that yet. I just knew he was stressed, and I wanted to do something useful and concrete in a period when everything felt slippery and abstract. I took the elevator to the 8th floor of the building on Atlantic Avenue. I signed in at the desk. The assistant wasn't there. Lunch hour. The main door was propped. The building had the particular quiet of a Friday afternoon when most people have already mentally left. I walked down the hallway toward Daniel's corner office. I heard voices before I saw anything. His voice and then a woman's. A laugh I recognized in the way you recognize music you grew up hearing. Not by conscious effort, but by something deeper and more involuntary. Something laid down in childhood before you knew what recognition was. I stopped in the doorway. Claire was sitting on the edge of his desk. His hands were on her waist. Her arms were loose around his neck. They were not kissing. I want to be precise about this because people always want to know the most dramatic version, and this is the honest version. They were not kissing. They were simply arranged the way 2 people arrange themselves when they have been together for months, when the novelty has worn off and what's left is something more comfortable and therefore more devastating. The ease of them. That's what I remember. Not passion. Ease. The total, unguarded ease of people who have stopped performing for each other and are simply existing together in their secret. They were laughing at something. They didn't see me. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. It was probably 20 seconds, maybe less. I watched Daniel's hands on my sister's waist. I watched my sister tip her head back and laugh. I watched and I understood what I was seeing before I had any words for it at all. It was a physical understanding. understanding. Something that happened in the stomach and the chest before it had any business in the mind. I set the lunch bag on the small table in the hallway, gently. I remember being careful about the noise. I walked back to the elevator. I went home. I sat on the bathroom floor of Daniel's brownstone for 2 hours. I know it was 2 hours because I was watching the shadow of the window frame move across the tile as the afternoon light changed. I could not move. I did not cry. I did not feel sad in any recognizable way. I felt the way you feel when something large and structural has shifted, like an earthquake that you register as a wrongness in the floor before you understand what it is. Eventually, I got up. I washed my face. I sat at the kitchen table and I waited. When Daniel came home that evening, I was still at the kitchen table. He walked in and saw me and he knew immediately. I could see it happen on his face. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a reckoning that he had known was coming and had been running parallel to for months without ever quite believing it would arrive. He sat across from me. I said, "How long?" He didn't pretend not to know what I meant. That was one thing about Daniel. He was not someone who wasted time on denials that weren't going to hold. When the game was over, the game was over. He'd been the same way in business. "Since November," he said. "The engagement party, my parents' house, the champagne from the good bottle." I looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood, at the place where his coffee mug had left a ring on the surface, which he'd never bothered to clean up. "Did you mean to?" I said. "When you proposed to me, did you mean it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. At the time, I asked him to leave. Not angrily. I didn't have anger yet. That came later. I asked him the way you ask someone to pass the salt. He left. He was back for his things within 48 hours, which told me he'd already been making arrangements. I called Claire the next morning. She didn't answer. I called again. She texted back, "I know you're upset. I'm sorry. Can we just wait for things to settle?" Wait for things to settle? As if this was weather? As if I was overreacting to a forecast? She came to the apartment 2 days after that and rang the bell until my downstairs neighbor came out and asked her, very politely, to please stop because her elderly mother was trying to sleep. She left a card. I opened it and read 2 lines. "I love you and I know you can't understand right now." And then I put it through my work shredder because I had come to my office to get away from the apartment and I didn't have the composure to hold it without doing something with it. My mother called every day for 2 weeks. She was devastated in the particular way of someone who loves multiple people in a conflict and cannot bear what that love requires of them. She said she didn't know what to say to me. She said she was sorry. She said she'd had a conversation with Claire that had been difficult. She did not tell me what was said. I did not ask. I gave notice on the apartment. I called my most essential Boston clients and told them I was relocating. 2 of them said they'd work with me remotely. 3 said they couldn't. I said I understood. I packed what fit in a rented cargo van. My books, my clothes, the kitchen things I'd bought myself, the record collection I'd been building since college. I left his good knives and his coffee maker and the throw blanket from his couch that I'd accidentally started thinking of as mine. In April of 2016, I drove 14 hours west to Chicago. I knew no one and nothing. That was the point. The 2 years that followed do not make a good story. They were exactly as unglamorous as genuine rebuilding always is. The kind of slow, incremental, often tedious work that happens in studio apartments at 11 o'clock at night when you're too tired to do it and do it anyway, because the alternative is not moving forward. I rented a studio in Wicker Park for $1,100 a month. I ate a lot of pasta. I worked 10-hour days building the Chicago client list from nothing, cold emails and referrals, and the kind of persistent, unremarkable effort that takes much longer than you expect and pays off much later than it promises. I went to therapy every Thursday afternoon with a woman named Dr. Elena Ose in an office on Dearborn Street, a woman who had the particular gift of listening so precisely that you could hear yourself differently when she was in the room. She did not let me get away with anything. Not one "I'm fine" that she didn't sit with patiently until I took it back. Not one moment of performed competence that she didn't gently name as armor. Not one session where I tried to talk about Daniel or Claire without her eventually steering us back to me, to the question of who I was outside the story I'd been telling about my sister's shadow. That question took a long time to answer. The anger came around 8 months in, not the cold shock from the bathroom floor. Real anger, the functional, inhabitable kind that tells you something was wrong and makes you capable of ensuring it doesn't happen again. I was grateful for it. I had been waiting for it without knowing I was. By 2018, I had 14 Chicago clients. By 2019, I had a firm, small, 4 people, including myself, with an office share arrangement in River North that cost us $1,600 a month, split 4 ways. The work was good. We had a specialty in brand identity for healthcare and nonprofit clients, which was a corner of the market that was underserved and that I genuinely cared about. It wasn't glamorous, it was honest. And somewhere in that process, in the slow, incremental accumulation of a life that was genuinely mine, I stopped checking Daniel's social media. I unlinked Claire's accounts from my browser so I would stop accidentally navigating to them in weak moments. I stopped measuring my life against the picture I'd had at 32. The measuring had always been the problem. It was what Claire had always wanted from me, that constant, grinding comparison that kept me oriented to her at the expense of being oriented to myself. The only way to win the game was not to play it. I stopped playing. I met Marcus Calloway in October of 2019 at a fundraiser for Lurie Children's Hospital. He was at the table adjacent to mine. He was there alone, which I noticed. He was not working the room, which I also noticed. He had the air of someone who had been talked into attending, and was now making peace with that decision one course at a time. I watched him for a while. He looked up and caught me watching him, and instead of the expected response, the slow smile, the calibrated lean forward, the performance of interest, he just looked mildly embarrassed and said, "Was I doing something weird?" I said, "No, I was just watching because you seemed real." He tilted his head. "As opposed to everyone else in this room." He considered that for a moment, looking out at the tables around us. "Fair," he said. He pulled out the empty chair at his table and said, "If I promise not to be fake, would you sit here?" I sat. Marcus Calloway was 41 at the time. He had founded an investment firm in 2012 called Foster Investments. He'd built it under his mother's maiden name, Foster, because he said he didn't want to lead with his own name until he'd done something that justified it. The firm had made 3 significant wins in 7 years: an early stake in a logistics startup that had been acquired for $430 million, a position in a clean energy company that had gone public in 2018, and a Series A in a biotech firm out of San Diego that was, at the time of our dinner, the fastest-growing company in its sector, with a current valuation that I would later understand was genuinely extraordinary. He was, by any objective measure, significantly wealthy. More wealthy than Daniel had ever been, or presented himself as being. More wealthy than any number he had ever casually mentioned. He didn't seem like it, or at least not in the way Daniel had seemed like it. Daniel had worn his money like a suit. You could always feel it on him, always feel its weight and its intention. It was part of how he stood, part of how he entered rooms, part of every choice he made about how to move through the world. Marcus wore his the way some people wear old jeans. It was simply there, neither hidden nor performed. He drove a used 2016 Volvo. He had a condo in Lincoln Park with books stacked on the side tables and a coffee machine that needed descaling, and windows that needed washing, and a couch that was simply a couch, not a statement about the kind of man who bought it. He cooked most of his own meals. He had one good suit that he wore to everything that required a suit. He owned it for at least 4 years that I can verify. We dated for 10 months before I told him about Daniel and Claire. Not because I was hiding it, because I was not ready for it to become part of our story before I knew what our story actually was. When I finally told him, sitting on the floor of his living room at midnight with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, because neither of us had reached for them in an hour, he listened all the way through without interrupting. Then he said simply, "That's a profound betrayal. Both of them." I said, "Yes." He said, "How are you now?" Not about them, about yourself. No one had asked me that question quite that way before. People had asked how I was coping, how I was processing, how I was moving forward. Marcus asked how I was, and meant it as a question about who I currently was, not about how I was managing the past. I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I think I'm becoming someone I actually like," which is new. He said, "That's the most important thing you could have said." I married Marcus Calloway in September of 2022, at a small ceremony in Wisconsin, at a vineyard owned by old friends of his who had converted an old dairy farm into something quietly beautiful. 22 people. My father, who cried from the first song to the last. 3 close friends from Chicago, some people from Marcus's firm. A college friend of mine from Boston, who had come with her husband and her new baby and had held my hand in the car on the way to the ceremony, and hadn't needed to say anything. No Boston family, no Claire. My mother had been too unwell to travel, and had said so without complaint, which was very her. She never made her limitations into other people's obligations. My mother called that night from Newton. I held my phone up so she could see the vineyard lights through the screen. She cried. She said I looked beautiful. She said Marcus seemed like someone good. I said, "He doesn't need to take care of me, but he's someone I want beside me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's better. That's actually better." She had her first stroke in January. She died in May on a Tuesday at 11:40 in the morning, while my father was holding her hand and I was 4 hours away on a plane I had booked too late to get there in time. I've made peace with that, mostly. Standing in the small family room of the Whitmore funeral home, I opened the door. Marcus was right there. He had been in the hallway, not because I'd asked him to wait specifically, but because he read rooms the way some people read maps. He had watched Claire pull me aside, and he had stayed close without hovering, present without intruding. That is the specific skill of someone who has paid careful attention to the difference between support and control. He stepped into the room. He was wearing his one good suit. He had brought a bouquet that morning for my mother, white peonies, because I had told him once that she had grown them in her garden for 20 years, and he had remembered. He had spent 20 minutes in the foyer with my father, talking about the Red Sox in the low, unhurried way that my father responded to most comfortably. He had not taken over. He had not made himself visible. He had simply been available, in the way that good people make themselves available, without condition, without fanfare. Claire looked at him. She processed him the way she processed all men, quickly, efficiently, with the same cataloging attention she brought to everything. Then she looked at me. "Elaine," she said carefully. "Who is this?" "My husband," I said. "Marcus Calloway." She extended her hand. She was composed. Whatever was happening beneath the surface, nothing showed. "Claire," she said. "Elaine's sister." Marcus shook her hand pleasantly. He said it was nice to meet her. He said he'd heard a lot about the family. Across the room, through the open door, I could see Daniel near the memory board, talking to a distant cousin of mine, our cousin Richard, who had always admired successful men with uncomplicated enthusiasm. I watched the exact moment Daniel registered Marcus. He went pale, not gradually, not with transition. One moment he was gesturing toward a photograph of my mother, mid-sentence about something, and then his eyes found Marcus, and the color simply evacuated his face. His hands dropped, his posture contracted. He looked for one unguarded second like a man who has just been told something true that he was hoping was still a rumor. Marcus turned his head. Their eyes met across the room. "Reynolds," Marcus said. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. Daniel crossed the room slowly, with the body language of a man calculating his options in real time and not finding anything workable. He had spent enough time in rooms with Marcus to know exactly what his presence meant. He had spent the last 7 years watching from a distance as Foster Investments did what his own fund had failed to do. He had filed for restructuring. He had rebuilt. But rebuilding from a position of known failure, in circles where everyone knows the history, is a particular kind of maintenance that requires constant vigilance. And Marcus Calloway's presence in this room, in this city, beside me, was a disruption that Daniel could not have planned for. "Foster," Daniel said. His voice was not quite right. "Reynolds." Same register, same even tone. Not a greeting and not a confrontation. Just the acknowledgement of two men who know exactly where they stand with each other. Daniel did what he always did when surprised. He reached for his social skills. He introduced himself to me as if we hadn't been engaged. He said it was good to see me, that I looked well, that he was sorry for my loss. He extended the same to Marcus, said it had been a long time, said the market had been interesting lately, said he'd been following some of Foster's recent activity with interest. Marcus said, "Yes, we've had a good run." Daniel asked about the biotech position in San Diego. He'd read about it. He said he had a few ideas he'd been developing in the clean energy space, adjacent to what Foster had done in 2018. He said he'd love to connect, to get Marcus's read on the market, to find a time when schedules aligned. Marcus said his schedule was quite full through the end of the year. His operations coordinator could set something up if Daniel wanted to reach out. He provided the coordinator's first name and the general office email. The politest destruction I have ever witnessed. Claire had been watching this exchange with an expression I could not fully read. Something was happening behind her eyes. A series of rapid recalculations. A reconstruction that was moving too fast for any of it to land clearly on her face. She turned to me. "Foster Investments," she said slowly, like a person saying a thing out loud to see if it sounds true. "The same," Marcus said. Daniel attempted another pivot. Something about a charity event he was organizing in the fall, an occasion where great minds in the investment space could connect. He said Marcus's participation would lend the event real credibility. He was using the language of flattery as leverage, which was something he'd always been good at, turning compliments into instruments. Marcus said he'd have to check the fall schedule. He thanked Daniel for thinking of him. Daniel nodded. Said, "Of course." Said, "Absolutely." Said he'd follow up. He walked back across the room and stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the way that meant he was managing something. Claire looked at me. I looked at her. In that moment, I saw something I had not seen on my sister's face in 6 years, possibly much longer. The performance had cracked, not all the way through, but there was something visible at the edge of it, a kind of tiredness, a kind of math. She said nothing, but she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe, in retrospect, as the beginning of something. It was 20 minutes after that, when my father grabbed his chest. The sound was wrong before I could name what was wrong about it. A sharp exhale, a catch, and then my cousin Richard saying, "Robert, Robert," in a voice that had gone very flat and careful. I turned and my father was in his chair near the coffin, near my mother's coffin, with his face the color of wet concrete and his right hand pressed against his sternum and his left hand gripping the armrest. The room moved. People stood. Dr. Susan Marsh, a friend of my mother's from book club who had known her for 20 years and had attended the service out of love, pushed through the gathering cluster with a quiet authority and said clearly, "Everyone give him space, please. Everyone just step back." Claire was beside him before I reached them. She dropped down with her hand on his cheek, saying, "Dad, Dad," in a voice that had nothing practiced in it, just fear, the pure, unconditional fear of a daughter. She looked up at me when I arrived, and we were not sisters with a history in that moment. We were just two people who loved the same man and were terrified of losing him too. I took his other hand. His grip was strong. That was good. His color was beginning to return, slowly, from the gray back toward something warmer. Dr. Marsh checked his pulse, kept her hand on his wrist, spoke to him in the low, even tones of a doctor who needs someone to stay calm and is modeling what that looks like. "Robert," she said, "I need you to take slow breaths, in through the nose, just like that." Good. He looked at her. He looked at Claire. He looked at me. He said, in a voice that was smaller than his normal voice but still his, "Your mother would be furious with me for making a scene at her funeral." Claire laughed. It was a real laugh, the surprised, involuntary kind. I squeezed his hand. Dr. Marsh said it appeared to be a vasovagal response, a fainting reflex triggered by acute stress, common in situations of profound grief. She wanted the EMTs to assess him to rule out anything cardiac, but she said carefully, quite confident that this was not his heart. She said it with the kind of precision that told me she was being honest with us rather than optimistic. The EMTs arrived within 10 minutes. They were thorough and kind. They confirmed Dr. Marsh's read. My father's heart was, for a man of 71 who had just buried his wife of 43 years, holding up. They recommended he rest for 20 minutes. They gave him water and established him in the quieter back room with a reclining chair that the funeral home home kept for exactly these occasions, which told you something about the frequency of these occasions. Claire and I went with him. We sat on either side of him in that back room, and we did not speak to each other. We listened to my father's breathing even out. We watched the water in his cup go still. After a while, my father said, "She used to say you two were her greatest joy and her greatest worry. Said she never knew which one you'd be on any given day." Neither of us answered. He said, "She never stopped hoping." Claire looked at the wall. I looked at my hands. He said, "I'm too tired to ask you both to fix things today, but I'm going to ask you not to make this harder than it is." Claire said, "We won't, Dad." He nodded. I said the same. We returned for the service at 4 o'clock. I stood at the podium with my eulogy in my hands. 9 pages, handwritten, transferred to a clean typed copy in the hours before the service, and I read about my mother the way she would have wanted to be read about, specifically, precisely, without melodrama. I read about her garden and the peonies she had planted in 2001, and the exact way she stood over them in the mornings before anyone else was awake, just looking. The way a person stands over something they love, because looking is its own kind of tending. I read about the chicken pot pie. I read about her 31 years in the classroom, about the students who had come to her services, about the boy she had called her best ever student who was now a published novelist and had sent a letter that I read aloud in full. I read about the Scrabble games and the 2 books a week and the reading glasses she had in every room because she never wanted to lose time hunting for them when a book was in her hands. I did not let my voice break. I looked at Marcus when I needed to. He looked back at me and did not look away. After the service, after the casseroles began arriving at my father's house in Newton in the reliable migration that always follows death, the lasagnas and the pot roasts and the coffee cakes that appear as if morning has a specific cuisine. After my father had been settled in his good chair with his tea and the television on at low volume and his sister Margaret beside him, talking about something quiet and familiar that I could hear from the kitchen as a gentle, low murmur. After Daniel had gotten into a black car and departed without saying goodbye to my father or to me, which was the kind of small revelation that settles something you had been wondering, Claire appeared at the front door of my parents' house, alone. She was still in her black dress, but she had taken off her heels and was standing on the front step in bare feet, which struck me as the most human I had seen her look all day. No Daniel, no car visible. Her hair had come down a little at the temple. I opened the door. She said, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. We went to the kitchen. Marcus was in the living room with my father. I could hear them, some baseball-adjacent conversation that my father was navigating with his usual enthusiasm. Marcus had the gift of being genuinely interested in other people's things. He had listened to my father talk about the 1986 Red Sox for 40 minutes last Thanksgiving without a single false note. I put the kettle on. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked up at me. She said, "The Cape Cod house isn't ours." I set the tea bags on the counter. "It's a rental," she said. "We rented it for 3 weeks in March. 8 bedrooms, private beach." I took photos. "I've been telling people we bought it." I poured the water. "I've been telling people a lot of things," she said, "for a while now." I brought the cups to the table and sat across from her. "Tell me what the actual things are." She looked at her hands again, then began. The ring was real. The ring had been the one thing she had insisted on, 3 years into the marriage, because she had needed something she could show. She had made Daniel buy it when they could not really afford to buy it. She had wanted people to know what kind of man she had. She had wanted me to know. The company, the acquisitions, the board seat in Austin, the 2 startup absorptions. Daniel was involved with all of those projects, but involved with, in the honest version, meant retained as a consultant. He had no equity positions. He had contracts. It was legitimate work, and he was good at it, but it was not what she had been describing when she described it to family, to friends, to anyone who asked. The version she had been describing was a version she had built on top of the actual version, the way you build something on top of a foundation that isn't quite level and tell yourself the lean isn't that bad. The Brookline townhouse, 3 bedrooms, nice street, a yard that she kept well because she needed something to take care of, was not a mansion. She had never described it as a mansion to anyone who would visit it, but she had constructed, through careful omission, a general impression of something grander. The impression was built from photos she had taken selectively, from descriptions that were technically accurate but chosen for maximum impact, from words that pointed toward something more expensive than what existed. And the nursery. She stopped when she got to the nursery. She said, "We've been having trouble, trying. We've been trying for 4 years and nothing has held. There have been 2 miscarriages. The designer from Newport, I met her at a party. I gave her my card. I've never called her." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the baseball game in the living room and my father laughing at something Marcus had said. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She looked at me. Her eyes were clear, not performing clarity, actually clear, with the particular, undefended quality that comes when someone has decided to stop holding something up. She said, "Because I walked into my mother's funeral and I told you I got the man, the money, and the mansion. And then your husband walked into the room." She paused, and Daniel went white. "He knew who Marcus was," I said. "He knew who Marcus was," she repeated. And in that moment, I understood something. I understood that I had spent 6 years building a story to show you. And the whole time, you were just living your life. Her voice had gone quiet. You weren't watching. You hadn't been watching. I was performing for an empty theater. I sat with that. She said, "I found a letter from a creditor in 2019 in Daniel's briefcase." I said, "What did it say?" She told me. "The restructuring arrangement with his Claire's remaining creditors, the specific amounts, the timeline of what had collapsed and when. She had read it in the kitchen of their Brookline townhouse on a Tuesday morning in March of 2019, and she had understood in that reading that the life she had left me to build had been a construction all along, that the man she had chosen over her own sister had chosen her because she was available, because she was willing, because she was a next chapter that didn't require him to explain the previous one. "Why did you stay?" I said. "Because I had already told everyone." She looked at the table. "Because I had told Mom. I had told our cousins. I had told everyone at that party that I was in love with him, and he was wonderful, and we were building something together. And I had already lost you. I couldn't also lose the story. If I left him, the story fell apart, and then what was any of it for?" I thought about the last 6 years, about Chicago, about the studio apartment and Dr. Osei on Thursday afternoons, and the 14 clients and the vineyard in Wisconsin, and Marcus in the car on the way home from somewhere, talking about something, the particular quality of his attention when he listened to me. I said, "What are you going to do?" "I called a lawyer this afternoon," she said. "A friend from grad school, family law. I'm not sure yet what the next steps are, but I'm done carrying the story." I nodded. She said, "The ring, keep it." I said, "I never wanted it back." She nodded. We sat for a while without speaking. The kitchen was full of the particular presence of my mother's absence, the countertop where she had always kept her cookbooks, the windowsill with the small clay pot one of her students had made for her in 1994 that had lived there ever since, the curtains in the yellow she had chosen 20 years ago and had never changed because she still liked them. The room felt inhabited and empty at the same time, which is, I think, what rooms feel like after the person who made them real has gone. I said, "I found her journal." Claire looked at me. I reached into my bag. I set the small leather journal on the table between us. "Last entry," I said. "Read it." She picked it up with the same careful hands she had always used for our mother's things. Claire had always been careful with objects, even when she wasn't careful with people. She read it. I watched her face. I watched the composed surface of her meet the words my mother had written on April 14th, 3 weeks before she died. When she set the journal down, she was crying. Not the correct kind from the service, the other kind, the kind that starts somewhere your composure can't reach. She said, "She never stopped." "No," I said, "she never did." We sat in my mother's kitchen in the house where we had both grown up, with the peonies just coming up outside in the garden she would not tend again, and we did not speak for a long time. The weeks that followed were not a reconciliation. I want to be clear about that because it would be dishonest to call them that. They were something smaller and more honest. The tentative resumption of contact between two people who have a shared history and an enormous amount of unprocessed grief and no clear map for what comes next. Claire told Daniel she needed a separation. She did this, she told me, the night of the funeral. She called her friend the family attorney from the car on the way home from my parents' house. The conversation with Daniel, when she finally had it, was apparently brief. He was not particularly surprised, which she said struck her harder than a fight would have. He had known for a long time, she thought, that they were both sustaining something that had run out of belief. He had been waiting to see who would be the first to say so. The separation papers were filed in June. Marcus and I flew back to Chicago 4 days after the funeral. My father was stable, attended to, surrounded by people who loved him and would stay close. He and I talked every Sunday. The calls were long and meandering and full of baseball, and my mother, and the particular pleasure of talking to someone who is simply glad to hear your voice. I called Claire 3 weeks after we landed. It was not a long call, maybe 12 minutes. We were both careful, in the way of people who have a long history of hurting each other, and are trying this time to be deliberate. She said she was still in the Brookline townhouse for now. She was seeing a therapist. She had reconnected with a college friend who lived in Cambridge and was checking in regularly. She said, "You looked happy at the funeral, underneath everything. You looked like a person who knows where they are." I said, "That's a good way to put it." She said, "I forgot what that looked like on you. I think I forgot you were someone I could look at and feel something other than competition." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it." "It doesn't," I said, "but it's something." "It's a start?" "It's a start," I said. "We have talked 4 times since then. Each call has been slightly longer than the last. I do not know what we are building. I do not think she knows either. We are proceeding carefully, with the particular combination of hope and caution that seems right for 2 people who share the same blood and the same mother's handwriting in the same cookbooks, and a 6-year silence that neither of them wants to see solidify into forever. My mother's estate was straightforward because she had been organized, which was absolutely her. 31 years of planning curriculum had given her a specific relationship with having her affairs in order. The house in Newton transferred to my father. Her savings were split evenly between Claire and me. There was the investment account my father would administer, and the contents of the house, which would be divided by mutual agreement over the summer. My father kept the things that were his. Claire and I each took what mattered to us. Claire took my mother's pearls, the ones she was wearing at the engagement party in 2014. I remember my mother wearing them in all the photographs from that night. I took the cookbook, the handwritten one, the index cards in the binder with my mother's name in faded marker on the cover, Patricia Hale. Her mother had given it to her as a wedding gift. She had added to it for 40 years. The handwriting spans decades. There is the younger version of her handwriting at the back, tighter and more careful, and then her later handwriting at the front, the loops more settled, more certain. The pot pie recipe is near the middle. Her handwriting, the exact instructions, the way she crossed her T's too far to the right, every every single time. I photocopied the recipe and mailed it to Claire in Brookline. She texted me the next morning. Thank you. I kept the original. I have been thinking about my mother's last journal entry since the day I found it. Not obsessively, not in the way I would have thought about something like that 6 years ago, when I had less control of my own mind and when other people's words had more power over my internal weather. Just the way you think about something that has been said well about something that is true, returning to it, turning it over. Not forgiveness, necessarily. I am not asking for the impossible, just the ability to be in the same room without armor on. She knew us. She knew what she was asking was not the grand gesture, but the small and difficult one. Not the tearful reconciliation in the doorway. She would have found that slightly embarrassing, honestly. She was not a dramatic person. She was a precise one. She asked for the specific thing that was possible, not the complete thing that wasn't. I don't know if Claire and I will be close again. Not in the way we might have been in some other version of this life. Some version where she made different choices at an engagement party in November of 2014, or where I had seen it coming and protected myself earlier, or where our mother had intervened differently, or where any of the 100 small things had gone differently and altered the shape of the years that followed. That version isn't available. You cannot return to the country you were living in before the earthquake. You can only learn to live in the one that's there when the shaking stops. What I know is simpler, and I think more durable. Marcus and I have dinner on Friday nights in our Lincoln Park condo. We cook together. He handles the protein. I do everything else, because that is the arrangement we settled into without discussing it, and neither of us has ever questioned it. We have a standing Sunday call with my father. We have a small garden behind the building. 6 raised beds. Nothing like my mother's, but real. Something alive and tended. I am 38 years old. I spent 6 years rebuilding something from nothing, and I built it well. I built it with someone who understood that the most important question you can ask another person is not what they have or what they've done, but who they currently are. I do not stand here asking for sympathy. I had a good life to begin with. I had a mother who loved me without condition, and a father who still does. I had work that mattered, and friends who stayed, and a city that became home. I had, in the middle of the worst year of my life, the clarity of a catastrophe that arrived early enough for me to rebuild properly. At 32, rather than 42, with enough time and enough elasticity remaining to make something real from what was left. And I had a sister who was complicated and selfish and performing and genuinely scared, and our mother's daughter, and I think not entirely past the possibility of becoming someone different. I don't know if she will. I am watching with cautious, undefended attention. When Claire walked into that funeral home with her ring and her summer house and her speech about the man and the money and the mansion, she was trying to show me that she had won. What she didn't understand, because she had been so focused on the performance that she had stopped seeing clearly, was that I had left the game years ago. You cannot beat someone at a competition they have stopped entering. You can only stand there with your costume and your rehearsed lines and realize gradually, with the particular discomfort of the long overdue, that the person you were trying to outrun is somewhere else entirely, living a life you don't have access to, looking at you not with envy, not with triumph, not even really with anger anymore, just with the clear, settled, permanent vision of someone who knows exactly who they are and has decided finally that this is enough. I got the man, the money, and the mansion, she had said. She had gotten Daniel Reynolds, a Brookline townhouse, and a story she couldn't sustain. What I had gotten was something harder to explain to people who haven't lived their way to it. The quiet, unkillable satisfaction of a life that is genuinely yours. The Sunday calls, the garden, the cookbook with my mother's handwriting in it, the husband who looks at me from the 3rd row when I'm standing at a podium and I need to remember why I'm holding it together. The ability to stand in a room with the person who hurt me most and feel, instead of devastation, something that is almost, not quite, but almost, like peace. Some things are hard to explain. The best I can say is this: when you stop measuring your life against someone else's performance and start measuring it against the things that actually matter to you, the specific, private, unglamorous things that make you feel like yourself, the measuring becomes easier. And then, eventually, unnecessary. My mother left this world wanting her daughters in the same room without armor on. We're not there yet, but we're trying. And I know, the way I know very few things with certainty, that if she could see us sitting across from each other in her kitchen, the tea going cold between us, the journal open on the table between us, the sound of my father laughing in the next room, she would recognize that as enough. Not the ending she might have wished for, but the one that's honest, the one that's possible, the one that's real. And for my mother, who spent 31 years teaching other people to find the truth inside the language, who told her students that the most important thing a sentence could be was true, that would have been more than enough. It would have been everything.